There's something most people don't know about Kurama. For most of the series, the most powerful of the tailed beasts didn't actually have a name at all. Not one the audience ever heard, anyway. If you go back and re-watch those early episodes, you'll notice that no one, not Naruto, not his teachers, not even the fox itself, ever calls it anything personal. It's simply the Kyuubi. And that word, Kyuubi, isn't a name in the way we usually think of names. In Japanese, it just means 9 tails. So for years, this creature was known only by a description, a head count of its tails, rather than by anything that belonged to it alone. That might sound like a small detail, but it shaped the way an entire generation of fans understood the character. When something goes unnamed for that long, the mind tends to fill in the blanks. And so, especially in the West, a lot of early viewers quietly assumed the fox was just a force, a wall of chakra, a natural disaster with fur, a kind of living weapon sealed away because it was too dangerous to reason with. It roared, it destroyed, it got sealed. That was the story people told themselves. But that assumption was wrong. And this is where it gets interesting, because the truth was always sitting right there in plain sight, waiting. Kurama was never a mindless force. From its very first real conversations with Naruto, deep inside the seal, the fox speaks with intelligence, with sarcasm, with resentment. It remembers things. It holds grudges that stretch back generations. It has pride, an enormous, wounded pride. This was a fully sentient being, aware of itself and its own long history, trapped behind bars and treated over and over again as nothing more than a tool. So the lack of a name wasn't a sign that the fox was empty. If anything, it was the opposite. The fox had a name. The humans around it simply never bothered to ask. And when you understand that, the story of when the name finally arrives starts to feel much heavier. Because the reveal came late, remarkably late. It wasn't in the original Naruto series, and it wasn't in the early stretches of Shippuden either. Fans followed this character for the better part of a decade without ever learning what to call it. The name Kurama doesn't surface until deep into the 4th Great Ninja War arc, near the end of the whole saga. Naruto, by that point, has spent his entire life carrying this creature inside him, feared for it as a child, hunted for it as a teenager, and only then, after everything, does the fox finally offer its true name, Kurama. And here's what's easy to miss, but what's really surprising comes next. That delay wasn't an accident of writing. It was the point. In storytelling, giving something a name is an act of recognition. You don't name a weapon, you name a partner. So the exact moment the fox says, Kurama, is the exact moment its relationship with Naruto changes for good. Before that, it was a prisoner and a jailer. After that, they're two beings who choose to fight side by side. The name marks the border between those two eras. It had to come late, because it had to be earned by both of them. Now, where did the name itself actually come from? This is the part that reaches back out of the story and into the real world. Masashi Kishimoto, the creator of Naruto, never fully explained the word Kurama, but many fans have long suspected it wasn't chosen at random. A popular theory holds that he drew it from Japanese folklore, specifically from the Kurama Tengu, a legendary mountain spirit tied to Mount Kurama, a real, sacred mountain that sits just north of Kyoto. The Tengu are supernatural beings from Japanese tradition, often depicted as fierce, powerful, and deeply connected to the mountains and forests they guard. Mount Kurama, in particular, has a long spiritual reputation. It's associated with martial legends and mystic training, the kind of place where, in the old stories, a great warrior might be taught secret techniques by a spirit. So there's a quiet logic to that idea. By this reading, Kishimoto took the name of a proud, formidable mountain spirit from real folklore and handed it to a proud, formidable spirit inside his own story. And that connection, if it holds, runs deeper than the sound of the word. Just like the Tengu of Mount Kurama, the Nine Tails is ancient, powerful, and bound to a place. In this case, bound inside a single human being. The folklore gives the character a kind of gravity it had carried silently the entire time, long before anyone knew what to call it. Which brings the whole thing full circle. For years, this creature was a nameless roar behind a seal, dismissed by many as a mindless beast. But it was sentient the entire time, waiting. And when its name finally arrived, echoing a sacred mountain and a spirit of old legend, it didn't just give the fox an identity. It quietly closed the distance between a boy and the beast he'd carried since the day he was born. What very few people realize is that Hagoromo Ōtsutsuki, the figure remembered across the ninja world as the Sage of Six Paths, wasn't just some distant legend who happened to leave a fox spirit behind. He was, quite literally, its creator. Kurama and the 8 other tailed beasts were never born the way ordinary creatures are. They didn't crawl out of some forgotten cave or descend from an older bloodline of monsters. They were made, deliberately, near the very end of Hagoromo's long life. And to understand why, you have to understand what came before them. Long before there were 9 beasts, there was only one, the 10 Tails, a single monstrous mass of chakra so overwhelming that no one person was ever meant to hold it. Hagoromo had spent much of his life dealing with the consequences of that creature's power, and he understood something that most people around him didn't. Power like that, gathered into one place, would always tempt someone to seize it. So he made a choice. Rather than let that force stay whole, he split the 10 Tails chakra apart, dividing it into 9 separate living creatures, each with its own shape, its own temperament, its own number of tails. But here's the detail that quietly reframes the entire story. Because all 9 were carved from that same original body, they weren't really rivals or strangers to one another. They were siblings. Kurama, the strongest of them with its 9 tails, shared the exact same source as the one-tailed Shukaku and every beast in between. What looked, for generations, like 9 unrelated monsters scattered across the world, was in truth a single family, split apart at the moment of their making. It's a strange thing to sit with, that the most feared creatures in the entire world were, from the very beginning, brothers and sisters born from one father. And that word, father, matters more than it first appears. Because Hagoromo didn't treat them like weapons or experiments. Before he died, he did something that a man building tools of war would never bother to do. He gave each of them a name. He spoke to them. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. He told them that the day would come when they'd be scattered and misunderstood, hunted and used, but that eventually a single person would appear who wouldn't try to control them, but to understand them and to bring them back together. It was, in every meaningful sense, a prophecy. And it pointed, across generations, straight toward Naruto. From a behind-the-scenes standpoint, this is one of the more elegant pieces of storytelling in the entire saga, because it was seeded quietly long before its payoff. Masashi Kishimoto didn't reveal the beast's shared origin all at once. For most of the series, Kurama is presented simply as a force of destruction, a calamity that flattened a village and had to be locked away. The audience, like the characters, is meant to fear it. So when the truth about Hagoromo finally surfaces late in the story, it lands with real weight, because it recontextualizes everything that came before it. And that recontextualization is the heart of it. Think about Kurama's actual history. For centuries, it was feared. It was hunted, passed from vessel to vessel, sealed away, blamed, and hated. Every human who encountered it seemed to want either to cage it or to use it. But the origin of that fox, the very reason it existed at all, traces back not to malice, but to love. Hagoromo created these beasts out of hope. He divided that terrible power not to make monsters, but to make sure that power could never again crush the world the way it once had. So the creature that generations came to see as a symbol of catastrophe was, at its root, an act of a dying man trying to protect the future. That's the quiet tragedy underneath Kurama's story, and it's what makes the eventual bond with Naruto feel less like a coincidence and more like something long intended. The beast spent lifetimes believing it was alone and despised. Yet the one person who created it had already, ages earlier, imagined someone exactly like Naruto arriving to prove that belief wrong. And it's worth noting how carefully the names themselves were chosen. For most of the run, the tailed beasts were referred to almost clinically by their number of tails. The 9 tails, the 8 tails, and so on. But those weren't their real names. Kurama had a name the whole time, given to it by Hagoromo, and it simply went unspoken for generations because the humans holding it never cared to ask. So when that name is finally spoken aloud, it isn't just a label. It's the fulfillment of something a father set in motion long ago, a small piece of a prophecy quietly clicking into place. And in that sense, everything the Sage of Six Paths built comes full circle. A power meant to be feared, a family split apart, a promise left behind, all of it waiting, patiently, for the one person Hagoromo always believed would come. The story of Kushina Uzumaki begins long before Naruto ever drew breath, and it hides one of the most overlooked records in the entire tale. Because when people think of the 9 tails, they picture the fox sealed inside a blonde-haired boy. But Naruto was never the first to carry that burden. He was, in truth, the third. The beast had already spent years locked away inside another body, his own mother's. That single fact changes everything. Kurama, the strongest of the 9-tailed beasts, needed a vessel strong enough to hold it, and ordinary shinobi simply would not survive the strain. So the choice fell not on a person, but on a bloodline. The Uzumaki clan was known for something no other clan could match, an unusually powerful life force and immense reserves of chakra. Their bodies aged slowly, their stamina bordered on inhuman, and that same vitality made them the only people alive who could suppress a creature as overwhelming as the 9 tails without being torn apart from the inside. But strength on its own was not enough. A jinchūriki does not last forever, and a seal cannot simply be abandoned when its host grows old. The power had to be passed on, carefully, from one generation to the next, and that meant Konoha needed a new Uzumaki to carry it. So Kushina was brought to the Hidden Leaf in secret, quietly moved from her homeland in the hidden Whirlpool village. She did not arrive as a wandering orphan or a lucky recruit. She was chosen, deliberately, to become the next living prison for the most feared beast in the world. Imagine that for a moment. A young girl, taken from everything she knew, told nothing at first, brought across borders under the strictest secrecy, all because her clan's blood happened to be strong enough to cage a monster. And she carried it. For years, Kurama lived inside her, held down by a seal and by the sheer force of her own vitality. To the outside world, she was simply Kushina, the fiery, red-haired kunoichi of the leaf. Almost no one knew the truth she carried beneath her skin. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come, because the very thing that made the Uzumaki perfect hosts came with a hidden flaw, one that almost no one talks about. A seal is not a fixed, unbreakable wall. Its strength rises and falls with the body that holds it. And there is one moment in a jinchūriki's entire life when that seal grows dangerously thin, not in battle, not in sleep, but in childbirth. It sounds almost backward. You would expect a jinchūriki to be at their most vulnerable in combat, surrounded by enemies. But the true weak point is far quieter and far more intimate. When a female jinchūriki gives birth, the seal loosens. The body's energy divides, the concentration required to hold the beast falters, and for a brief, fragile window, the cage weakens. This is not a small detail. It is one of the most closely guarded dangers in the entire system of the tailed beasts, precisely because it is so easy to overlook. And that single weakness is where Kushina's story turns. Because that is the exact moment Kurama was torn free. On the night Naruto was born, as Kushina lay at her most exhausted and the seal thinned to its breaking point, an attacker exploited that fragile moment to tear the fox loose. Everything that had held it for years, the strength of her clan, the careful design of the seal, the secrecy that surrounded her arrival in Konoha, all of it came down to that one unavoidable moment of weakness. The Uzumaki vitality that made her the perfect host could do nothing about the one flaw built into the very act of new life. So the beast broke loose. And here is the quiet, causal chain that so few people trace all the way back. Kurama did not end up inside Naruto by chance. It ended up there because it escaped his mother first. The escape during his birth is the reason his life took the shape it did. He became a jinchūriki not through some grand ceremony or noble sacrifice on his part, but as the direct consequence of a seal that failed at the one instant it was always most likely to fail. Think about how much of his story flows from that. The isolation he grew up with, the suspicion of the village, the power sleeping in his gut that would one day change the world. None of it began with Naruto. It began with Kushina, with a girl carried in secret across a border, chosen for the strength in her blood, entrusted with a monster, and undone in the most human moment imaginable. So when the histories speak of the Nine-Tails host, remember the record that came before. Remember that the fox was never truly his to begin with. It was inherited, passed down through a bloodline built to endure it, released in the one heartbeat when even the strongest vessel could not hold. And in that quiet, overlooked truth lies the real beginning of everything that followed. Behind the familiar appearance of Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage, there's a decision most people misremember entirely. The story usually gets told as something simple. The village was attacked. A father sealed a monster into his newborn son and gave his life to do it. That's the version people carry with them. But the truth is stranger and far more deliberate than the shorthand suggests. When Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, tore through Konoha on the night of Naruto's birth, Minato faced a problem with no clean answer. The beast in front of him was not something that could be killed. It was chakra given shape and will, a force that would simply reform in time. So sealing it away was the only path forward. But here's where the common understanding falls apart. Minato did not seal the whole fox into his son. He didn't even try to. Instead, he split Kurama in two. This is the counterintuitive heart of the whole event. The fox was not a single thing passed intact into a child. Minato divided it, separating its power into two halves, the yin and the yang. And he sent each half to a different destination. The yin half, the darker, denser portion of Kurama's chakra, he did not entrust to anyone. He took it into himself. To do that, he called on the Reaper Death Seal, one of the most feared techniques in the entire world. It's a summoning that draws out a death god, and the price for using it is fixed and absolute. The user's own soul is claimed in exchange. Minato knew this before he began. He understood that the moment he locked Kurama's yin half inside his own body, he was sealing away his own life along with it. There was no version of this where he walked away. So he chose to carry the heavier burden himself, and he paid for it with everything he had. That left the other half, the yang chakra, still needing a home. And this is where the newborn came in. Minato used the 8 trigrams seal to place that remaining portion into the infant Naruto. So from his very first night alive, Naruto was not carrying the 9-tailed fox. He was carrying half of it. For years, through his entire childhood and well into his teens, the boy everyone feared as the container of the beast was only ever holding a fraction of what people imagined. But here's what almost nobody knows. Minato didn't stop at the sealing itself. In the same act, working against the clock with his own death already closing in, he did something quieter and more personal. He hid a small measure of his own chakra inside the seal. And Kushina, Naruto's mother, dying beside him, did the same. They embedded pieces of themselves directly into the design, not as power, but as a kind of message left waiting. The reason was simple, and it's the part that tends to stay with people. Neither of them would live to raise their son. They knew that. So they built into the seal a single, delayed meeting. The chakra they left behind was set to activate only under certain conditions, years down the line, when Naruto had grown strong enough to begin confronting the fox inside him. And when that moment finally came, they appeared to him. First his father, then later his mother, as living echoes, able to speak, to explain, to steady him at the exact point he needed it most. Parents who had been gone since his first day, reaching him across more than a decade, precisely when it mattered. Think about what that means when you put it all together. Kurama was not simply imprisoned. It was deliberately taken apart and distributed. One half locked away with a dying man's soul behind the Reaper death seal, the other half placed into a child behind the 8 trigrams. 2 people, 2 seals, 1 beast, split down the middle by design. This wasn't panic. It was a plan carried out in the span of a single desperate night by a man who was already dying as he made it. And that division changed the shape of everything that followed. Because Naruto only ever held the yang half, his relationship with the fox was, for a long time, incomplete in a very literal sense. Part of Kurama simply wasn't there. It was elsewhere, dormant, waiting. So when Naruto eventually set out to master the power sealed inside him, he was chasing something that had been intentionally broken in 2 before he could ever remember. His long journey toward becoming whole, toward reclaiming and reuniting what had been separated, began not with his own choices, but with a father's calculated act on the night he was born. So the familiar image gets it backward. Minato's final gift to his son was not the burden of a monster. It was a monster carefully halved, a hidden farewell folded into the seal, and a purpose that would only reveal itself years later. The sacrifice everyone remembers was real, but the design behind it was the part that truly shaped what came next. If you look closely at Madara Uchiha, you start to notice that the darkest night in Konoha's history wasn't really about the fox at all. Everyone remembers the 9 tails tearing through the village, leveling homes, ending lives, forcing the 4th Hokage into the sacrifice we already talked about. But the beast that arrived that night wasn't acting on its own hunger, and it wasn't choosing its targets. It was being steered. Deep inside its own mind, Kurama had lost control, because a pair of eyes had reached in and taken the wheel. Those eyes belonged to the Sharingan. And this is the part that quietly changes everything you thought you understood about that attack. The Uchiha clan's dojutsu, in its most developed forms, carried a rare and frightening ability. A powerful enough wielder could look into the eyes of a tailed beast and dominate its mind completely, bending that ocean of chakra to a single human will. Kurama, the strongest of the 9, the fox that had roamed for 1,000 years, could be reduced to a tool. Not persuaded, not tricked, enslaved. So when the fox appeared over Konoha that night, it looked like a natural disaster, a monster driven by rage. But behind those slitted red eyes was another set of eyes entirely, calm and patient, giving the orders. The rampage wasn't chaos. It was a command being carried out. And because no one in the village could see the hand on the controls, they blamed the only thing they could see. They blamed the fox. That misunderstanding is where the tragedy really begins. Think about what the average villager experienced. Their homes burned, their families were buried, and the thing responsible was a 9-tailed monster of pure malice. There was no reason for them to imagine a puppeteer standing in the shadows. So an entire generation grew up certain of a simple story. The fox is evil. The fox attacked us. The fox must be contained. And that belief hardened into something that would shape a child's whole life, long before that child ever understood why he was hated. But here's the twist that turns the whole thing on its head. Kurama didn't love the Uchiha, and it didn't serve them willingly. In fact, the fox despised them, and it despised them for exactly this reason. Those eyes that could reach into its mind and turn it into a weapon were, to Kurama, the ultimate insult. For a being that valued its freedom above everything, nothing was more hateful than a person who could strip that freedom away with a single glance. So the creature everyone assumed was drawn to darkness was actually the victim of it, forced again and again to commit crimes it never chose, by the very clan it hated most. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. The manipulation didn't just cause one terrible night. It created a loop, a cycle that fed on itself. Kurama would be controlled, forced to attack, and then punished for the attack as if it had acted alone. The humans grew more afraid, so they gripped it tighter, sealed it deeper, treated it more like a threat. That fear made the beast more bitter, more isolated, more convinced that people would only ever see it as a monster. And that bitterness made it easier to paint as one. Every rampage confirmed the story, even though the story was a lie from the start. So you get this strange, tragic symmetry. The fox was punished for the actions of a puppet, while the person holding the strings walked away unseen. Madara understood something that almost no one else did, that the Sharingan wasn't just a weapon for fighting other people. It was a leash, and with that leash, a single man could aim the most powerful of the tailed beasts at whatever he wanted, then vanish before the blame ever landed on him. Now, consider how much of the later story depends on this one hidden fact. If the village had known the truth that night, that the fox was controlled and not simply evil, the child who carried it might have been treated as a survivor instead of a suspect. The loneliness, the whispers, the cold looks, so much of that came from a misunderstanding that a pair of eyes had deliberately created. The manipulation didn't end when the fox was sealed away. It kept working quietly for years, shaping how people looked at a boy who had done nothing wrong. And that's what makes Madara's role here so unsettling in its simplicity. He didn't need an army to wound Konoha this deeply. He needed one beast, one moment of control, and the certainty that people would fill in the rest of the story on their own. Fear did the work he couldn't. The village convinced itself of a version of events that protected the real culprit and condemned the innocent, and it held on to that version for a very long time. So the fox that terrorized Konoha was never truly free that night. It was a prisoner wearing the face of a monster, hated for crimes chosen by someone else, carrying a resentment toward the Uchiha that made perfect, painful sense. And the man who arranged it all simply watched, letting a single misunderstanding grow into a legend. People rarely talk about Naruto Uzumaki as someone connected to anything beyond his own village. For most of his early life, he seemed isolated, an orphan carrying a weight no one wanted to acknowledge. But the truth is that Naruto was already bound to something far larger than himself, something ancient, something that predated every human conflict he would ever witness. Sealed inside his body was Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, a being of pure chakra born from the will of the sage of the six paths. And for years, the two of them lived as strangers sharing the same skin. They despised each other. That hatred wasn't quiet either. It played out in a strange, shadowed corner of Naruto's own mind, a flooded chamber where a massive iron cage held the fox behind bars. Whenever Naruto ventured inward, he found the same thing waiting. Two enormous red eyes glaring through the darkness, a voice dripping with contempt. Kurama saw humans as jailers, nothing more. Naruto saw the fox as the source of every cruel look he had ever received. So they communicated only through those bars, trading threats, neither willing to give an inch. But the turning point came from somewhere unexpected. During a battle deep within his own subconscious, Naruto began to lose control, the fox's chakra threatening to overwhelm him entirely. And then a presence appeared. The memory of his mother, Kushina Uzumaki, who had been the previous jinchūriki, the previous host of Kurama. She had left behind a fragment of her chakra for exactly this moment. With her help, Naruto managed to overpower the fox and pull its chakra loose, seizing control in a way no host had done so cleanly before. It was, in that instant, a victory through force. And here is where most stories would end, with the hero dominating the monster, chaining it tighter, ruling it forever. That was the traditional method. Every jinchūriki before Naruto had been taught the same lesson, that the beast inside was a weapon to be suppressed, a danger to be managed through willpower and fear. Kurama expected nothing different. It waited for the gloating, the triumph, the tightening of the seal. But what's really surprising comes next. Naruto didn't do any of that. Instead of standing over the fox as a conqueror, he did something that had rarely been tried in centuries of this bitter arrangement. He spoke to Kurama not as a jailer, but as someone who understood. He told the fox that he knew what it felt like to be feared, to be hated for something you never chose, to be alone, with no one willing to look past the surface. Naruto had lived that exact loneliness as a child, so he recognized it in the creature that had spent generations locked behind bars, passed from host to host, never once treated as anything but a curse. That single moment of empathy cracked something that force never could. Kurama, who had known nothing but resentment for as long as it had existed, began to see the boy differently. Not as a cage, but as a companion who shared the same wound. And slowly, over the course of their struggles together, that recognition grew into something almost unheard of in their world. A genuine friendship. Not obedience, not control, but trust between two beings who had every reason to hate each other and chose otherwise. They sealed that bond with something almost absurdly simple: a fist bump. In the middle of one of the largest wars their world had ever seen, the boy and the ancient fox pressed fist to giant paw, and a jinchūriki and a tailed beast stood as true equals. No seal holding one above the other, no fear. Just two partners who had finally decided to fight on the same side. Kurama even offered its true name for the first time, a name it had guarded for centuries, a small gesture that carried enormous meaning. And that partnership changed everything about what Naruto could do. The old method, forced control, always came with a cost. Hosts who drew on their beast's power through domination risked being consumed by it, their bodies breaking down, their minds slipping toward rage. But because Naruto and Kurama now worked together willingly, Naruto could enter what became known as Kurama mode. He would cloak himself in a shroud of golden chakra, glowing with intricate markings, wielding a fraction of the fox's immense power without any of the danger that had destroyed hosts before him. It proved a quiet truth that the entire history of jinchūriki had missed. Cooperation was stronger than control. Every generation before had assumed the beast had to be caged, subdued, forced into submission. But the greatest power came the moment someone finally chose to understand instead of dominate. Two strangers, sealed together against their will, connected to a piece of the universe far older than either of them, became something neither could have been alone. And it began not with strength, but with a single, honest sentence, spoken to a creature everyone else had given up on. Curiously enough, Gaara was never meant to be understood the way Naruto eventually understood him. To the people of the Hidden Sand, he was a weapon first, and a child second, and for most of his early life, that order never reversed. But to understand why his story matters, you have to look at what was sealed inside him, because the creature living in Gaara was part of something much larger than a single village's fear. Inside Gaara lived Shukaku, the One-Tail. And Shukaku, as it turns out, sits at the very bottom of a family of 9. The tailed beasts are ranked by the number of tails they carry, which means Shukaku, with only one, was the youngest and the weakest of them all. At the very top of that same family sat Kurama, the 9 tails, whose 9 tails marked it as the most powerful beast in existence. So, in a strange, quiet way, Gaara and Naruto were carrying siblings. One boy held the eldest brother of that family, and the other held the youngest. They didn't know it yet, but they were connected long before they ever spoke. That connection ran deeper than shared power. Gaara's childhood, if you set it beside Naruto's, is almost unsettling in how closely the two lines up. Both were made jinchūriki as infants, before they could consent or even understand what was happening to them. Both were feared by the very villages that created them. Both grew up isolated, watched, and quietly avoided by the people around them. The difference was simply how each boy answered that loneliness. Naruto turned outward and reached for others. Gaara, given no such lifeline, turned inward and decided that the only person he could ever love was himself. So the same wound produced two entirely different people, and that contrast is really the whole point of Gaara's early arc. Because here is the thing the story keeps insisting on. A jinchūriki and their beast are not two separate prisoners. They are two halves of the same isolation. Shukaku fed on Gaara's fear and paranoia, and Gaara's fear and paranoia grew because Shukaku was never at peace. The host shaped the beast, and the beast shaped the host, and neither could escape the loop alone. So when people looked at Gaara and saw a monster, they were, in a sense, looking at a reflection of how they themselves had treated him. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the resolution of that loneliness didn't come from strength at all. Gaara was overwhelmingly powerful. His sand defended him without a thought, and for years he believed that power was the same thing as purpose. But it was losing to Naruto, and then being spoken to as a person rather than a weapon, that actually changed him. So the boy who once existed only to prove his own right to live slowly became something no one had predicted. He became a leader. Gaara eventually rose to become the 5th Kazekage, the youngest in his village's history, a former outcast now trusted to protect the very people who had once feared him. That reversal is one of the quietest, most complete redemptions in the entire story. But his personal transformation was only part of a much larger pattern, and the war that came later revealed just how connected all of these beasts had always been. During the 4th Great Ninja War, something happened that had never happened before in recorded history. All 9 of the tailed beasts, Kurama included, were briefly gathered together inside Naruto through their shared chakra link. For the first time, the entire family stood in one place, the eldest and the youngest, and everyone between them, no longer scattered and no longer sealed apart. And that reunion revealed something that reframes everything that came before it. The beasts had always been able to sense one another. Even locked inside separate hosts, buried in separate villages, kept ignorant of each other for generations, they had never truly been alone. They were siblings spread across the world, aware of each other in a way that no wall or seal could fully sever. So all those years that Gaara spent believing he was fundamentally isolated, the creature inside him had never once lost track of its family. The loneliness was real for the boy, but it was, in a sense, a misunderstanding at the deepest level. The connection had been there the whole time, which is what makes Gaara's legacy so lasting. He is proof of the idea the story returns to again and again, that no one is beyond reach, and no one is truly meant to be alone. He carried the smallest of the 9 beasts, and yet his change of heart rippled outward until it helped bring an entire generation of jinchūriki toward understanding rather than fear. So the youngest brother of that ancient family, sealed into a frightened child no one wanted, became one of the clearest examples of what these bonds could accomplish. And it all traced back to that same simple truth, that the beast and the host were never separate, and never as alone as either of them believed. Originally, Hashirama Senju wasn't remembered as the man who befriended a tailed beast at all. That gentler story, the one where a fox and a person slowly learned to trust each other, belonged to a later age. In the founding era, the picture was much colder, and Kurama sat at the center of it not as a companion, but as something closer to a captured weapon. You might assume the Nine Tails was always bound to the Uzumaki and the Namikaze, that its fate ran naturally through those 2 bloodlines. But the earliest recorded jailer wasn't a Namikaze at all, and it wasn't even a shinobi born to seal it. It was Hashirama Senju who first subdued Kurama in open battle, and only afterward did the question arise of where such a creature could possibly be kept. That question was answered during the famous clash at the place that would later be called the Valley of the End. It's a location remembered mostly for a different fight, one between 2 students generations down the line. Yet the same ground held an older, quieter turning point. There, Hashirama's wife, Mito Uzumaki, used the sealing techniques unique to her clan to draw Kurama inside her own body. With that act, she became the very first jinchūriki of the 9 Tails, the origin point of a role that would define so many lives to come. And this is where the pattern begins to make sense. Kishimoto tied the whole arrangement to the lore of chakra chains and the strange strength of the Uzumaki line. That clan carried an unusually powerful life force and an unmatched talent for sealing, which meant their bodies could contain a beast whose chakra would have torn most hosts apart. So Kurama wasn't passed from one Uzumaki woman to the next by accident. It happened because they were, quite literally, the only vessels built to hold it. The seal was a matter of survival, not sentiment. There's an irony buried in that. Hashirama had a gift almost no one else in history could claim. With his wood release, he could suppress and even tame the tailed beasts, calming their raw chakra long enough to bring them under control. Because of that ability, he ended up in possession of several of them at once. More power gathered in one place than any single village had a right to hold. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Rather than hoard that power, Hashirama chose to give much of it away. In an effort to balance the strength between the hidden villages and hold together a fragile peace, he distributed several tailed beasts to other nations, handing over creatures that others could only dream of controlling. It's one of the strangest generosities in the entire history of the shinobi world. A man parceling out living weapons in the name of stability. But Kurama was the exception. Of all the beasts he had subdued, the Nine-Tails carried a hatred so deep and so volatile that giving it away was never truly an option. Its resentment made it too dangerous to trust in distant hands, so instead of being sent off like the others, Kurama was deliberately kept close. It stayed sealed within the leaf's own, bound by marriage into the founding family, and watched far more carefully than any beast handed to a rival village. What looked like favoritism was really caution. The fox was kept near not out of affection, but because no one dared let it drift beyond reach. So the calm image that so many people carry, of a fox quietly bonded to a hero who understands it, belongs to a much later chapter. It was earned slowly, across decades of pain and misunderstanding, and it was anything but the beginning. In the founding era, Kurama was essentially a war prize. It was won in battle by Hashirama, contained through the sealing arts of the Uzumaki, controlled through a marriage that linked two powerful clans, and held in place by nothing more forgiving than sealing scrolls and sheer human willpower. And that's the quiet mistake history almost made permanent. The Nine-Tails could have been remembered forever as a monster, a possession, a thing controlled and never truly known. Every early sign pointed that way. It had been captured, sealed, and passed along like an inheritance no one really wanted to carry, its own voice unheard beneath layer after layer of restraint. By every expectation of its time, that should have been the whole story. Instead, that grim beginning became the very thing the later bond had to overcome. And in a strange way, it made the eventual friendship mean more. The fox that started as a trophy, moved from host to host, guarded because it was feared, was the same fox that would one day choose to trust. What began as control ended, generations later, as something freely given from both sides. And so even the coldest part of Kurama's past, the era of seals and war prizes and careful chains, quietly set the stage for the truth that would outlast all of it, that the beast and the host were never really meant to stay enemies, no matter how the story first appeared. One often overlooked detail about Mito Uzumaki is that she holds a record so quiet, so easy to miss, that most people who loved this story never stopped to notice it at all. She was Kurama's very first human vessel. Not one of many in a long line stretching back forever, but the first true jinchūriki of the Nine-Tails, the woman who carried the strongest of the tailed beasts inside her body for decades, all the way into old age. And yet you rarely hear her name spoken in the same breath as the great warriors of her era. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what Kishimoto was quietly building underneath the surface. When he designed her sealing method, he didn't reach for the obvious answer. He didn't make her strength a matter of raw power or iron chains or some overwhelming force pressing the fox down. He built her seal around love. That was the hidden idea tucked into her character from the very beginning. A jinchūriki whose heart was full of affection could keep the beast's hatred from ever breaking free, because there was simply no room for that hatred to take root. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this is easy to misread. You might expect the first host of the most terrifying creature in the world to be a battlefield legend, someone remembered for clashing against Kurama in some titanic struggle. But that isn't Mito at all. Her strength was never in fighting the fox. It was in containment, in staying so calm, so composed, so quietly at peace that the single most destructive tailed beast simply stayed dormant inside her for a lifetime. That's the counterintuitive truth. The person who tamed Kurama the longest was not a warrior swinging jutsu on the front lines. She was a still center, and the beast slept because of it. And she understood exactly what she was doing, which is why she passed that knowledge forward. Years later, she would sit with a young girl named Kushina and explain the secret plainly. A jinchūriki's heart, she taught, has to be filled with love. Fill it with enough affection, and the hatred of the beast has nowhere to go. It's a lesson that sounds gentle, almost too simple, but here's what almost nobody knows about it. That single piece of advice becomes one of the quiet threads running through the entire saga, echoing forward across generations, all the way down to Naruto himself. The idea that connection, not domination, is what truly holds the darkness at bay. Mito planted that seed. But there's a mechanical reason her story doesn't simply end with her, and it's woven right into the rules of the world. A seal like hers isn't permanent. It weakens at two specific moments: when the jinchūriki dies and when a female jinchūriki gives birth. At those instants, the containment loosens, and the beast could tear its way free. So, the village couldn't just let Mito grow old and pass away with Kurama inside her. They needed a successor ready, someone who could inherit the fox before that seal ever had the chance to fail. And this is where a small, easy-to-miss piece of the map suddenly matters. The seal worked best within a very particular bloodline. The Uzumaki clan, famous for their extraordinary vitality and their mastery of sealing techniques, were uniquely suited to hold a tailed beast for the long haul. Mito was an Uzumaki, so the village didn't look just anywhere for her replacement. They looked for another Uzumaki. That is the real reason a young girl was quietly brought from the land of whirlpools, from the hidden village of Uzushiogakure, all the way to Konoha. Kushina wasn't chosen at random. She was chosen because of her blood, and because of what her blood could carry. So, follow the chain here, because it's beautiful in how neatly it fits together. Mito's seal was built on love. Therefore, the wisdom of that seal had to be taught, not just imposed. That teaching had to be passed to someone who could survive holding the fox. Therefore, it had to be another Uzumaki. And the search for that Uzumaki is precisely how Kushina crossed the sea and entered the story we all know. Every step follows from the last, and Mito stands quietly at the very front of it. Which brings us back to that overlooked record we started with. Mito became the hidden bridge in Kurama's long history. Not the loudest figure, not the flashiest, not the one the story lingers on. She was the calm elder who received the fox first, held it the longest through sheer composure, and then handed down two things at once: the beast itself and the wisdom of how to live alongside it. She did all of this without ever reaching for the spotlight, without ever needing to be seen as the hero. And that's the quiet Easter egg buried in her character, that the whole chain of jinchūriki, all the pain and all the healing that follows, begins not with a battle, but with a woman who understood that love was the strongest seal of all. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Obito Uchiha. And it starts by turning everything you thought you knew about that terrible night upside down. Because when Kurama tore through Konoha, leveling homes and killing dozens of shinobi, the fox wasn't the villain of the story at all. It wasn't acting on its own free will. It wasn't a monster that simply broke loose. Behind that rampage stood a single figure, a masked man, calmly bending one of the most powerful creatures in the world to his purpose, with nothing but his eyes. That man was Obito Uchiha, and once you know that, the whole meaning of the attack shifts. Kurama wasn't a rampaging beast on that night. Kurama was a hijacked weapon. The devastation that shaped Naruto's entire life, the reason he grew up an orphan, the reason the village looked at him with fear, all of it traces back not to the fox's rage, but to a person pulling the strings from the shadows. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because to understand how one man could dominate a tailed beast, you have to look at how Kishimoto designed the Sharingan in the first place. The Uchiha eyes were never really built around brute strength. They were built around perception, around genjutsu, around control. And at the very top of that power sits the Mangekyo Sharingan, the awakened form that grants abilities far beyond ordinary vision. Only an eye like that could reach into a creature as vast as the Nine Tails and seize its mind. So the attack wasn't a display of raw force. It was a display of manipulation. And that distinction matters, because it means Kurama's fury that night wasn't really Kurama's at all. The fox was a prisoner inside its own body, driven forward against its will. Think about that for a moment. The creature the entire village came to hate, the creature Naruto spent years learning to tame and eventually befriend, was on that night just as much a victim of Obito as the people it destroyed. Its power was real, but its choice was stolen. Now, why did Obito go after Kurama in the first place? And why that specific moment? Because timing was everything. A jinchūriki's seal is at its weakest during childbirth, and Kushina Uzumaki was giving birth to Naruto. Obito exploited that window precisely. He ripped Kurama out of her, and that single act set off a desperate chain of events. Because once the fox was free and under his control, someone had to stop it, and someone had to contain it again, immediately. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. That someone was Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage. And here's the part that reveals just how much of Naruto's fate was decided in the span of a single night. Minato couldn't simply seal the entire fox back into Kushina. She was dying, and a full resealing would have required more than she could give. So he made a choice under impossible pressure. He split Kurama's chakra in two. He sealed one half, the darker yin half, into himself, and the other half, the yang, into his newborn son. That is the reason Naruto became a jinchūriki at all. Not destiny in some grand cosmic sense, but an emergency solution to a crisis that Obito had engineered. So follow the chain backward, and something almost unbearable comes into focus. The loneliest childhood in the series, the whispered fear of an entire village, the burden Naruto carried before he could even speak. All of it exists because a grieving young Uchiha decided to weaponize the fox. Obito's actions didn't just harm Konoha in the moment. They rewrote the life of a child who wasn't even a day old. And this is where the alternative version of the story becomes so striking. Because for the longest time, the fandom, and even the narrative itself, pointed at someone else entirely. The masked man was believed to be Madara Uchiha, the legendary ancestor, the founder's rival. That was the assumption for years. The idea that the true culprit was Obito, a character introduced early and seemingly killed off long before, was a reveal that reframed everything that came before it. The monster behind the mask wasn't an ancient legend. It was a broken boy who had lost the person he loved most, and who had been shaped into a weapon himself. Which brings the whole thing full circle in a quiet, tragic way. Kurama became a symbol, but not the symbol most people assumed. Not just a symbol of overwhelming, destructive power. A symbol of manipulation, of what happens when grief is turned into a tool, and when a living being is reduced to a weapon in someone else's plan. The fox spent decades hated for a night it never chose. And maybe that's the quietest lesson buried in the Nine-Tails story. That the greatest danger was never the beast's power on its own, but the hands that reached out to control it. Obito didn't create Kurama's strength. He only stole its will for a single night, and in doing so, he set in motion nearly everything that followed. There's something most people don't know about Killer Bee. He wasn't just another jinchūriki standing in the background of Naruto's story. He was, in many ways, the answer to the question the entire story kept asking. Because if you want to understand Kurama, the Nine-Tails, you first have to understand the one man who had already done what Naruto spent years struggling toward. Killer Bee was the host of the Eight-Tails, a beast named Gyuki. And where Naruto and Kurama spent the early part of their lives locked in mutual hatred, sealed together, but never truly together, Bee had reached something entirely different. He had reached friendship. His bond with Gyuki wasn't built on chains or suppression. It was built on trust, earned slowly, until the beast inside him became something closer to a partner than a prisoner. And that matters, because it reveals what Kishimoto was really doing. He didn't write Bee as a rival or a warning. He wrote him as a mirror. Bee shows us what a cooperative bond between human and tailed beast actually looks like when it works. So when we look back at Naruto and Kurama snarling at each other through the bars of a cage, we're meant to feel the distance between where they started and where Bee already stood. But the contrast goes deeper than that, because it was Bee, not a Hokage, not a sage, who taught Naruto how to befriend a tailed beast in the first place. When Naruto came looking to master Kurama's power, he came expecting a fight. He expected to dominate the fox, to overpower it, to force it into submission. And Bee gently corrected him. You don't take a beast's strength, he showed him. You ask for it. You earn it. This is the surprising lesson buried in the whole arc, and it's easy to miss. Raw power over Kurama never came from suppression. Every attempt to cage the fox, to bind it, to control it by force, only deepened its rage. The real strength came from respect, from cooperation, from treating the beast not as a weapon, but as a being with its own will. That's a strange idea for a story about ninja and war, but what's really surprising comes next, because it explains why these two vessels ever met at all. The Eight-Tails and the Nine-Tails weren't just two powerful beasts. They were the two strongest that remained. And that made them the final targets of the Akatsuki, the organization hunting all 9 beasts to complete their plan. So it wasn't chance that brought Bee and Naruto together. It was necessity. With the two most dangerous vessels in the world being hunted, the hidden villages did the logical thing. They hid them. And they hid them in the same place, so they could be protected together, and so they could train side by side. Think about how quietly clever that arrangement is. The two beasts everyone feared most were placed under the same guard, on the same island, and in doing so, the perfect student was placed beside the perfect teacher. Naruto, still fighting his own beast, was set down right next to the one man who had already won that fight. The threat of Akatsuki, the very thing meant to destroy them, was what created the conditions for Naruto to finally understand Kurama. And who was this teacher? On the surface, Killer Bee is almost comic. He's a rapping swordsman who speaks in rhymes, who fights with a style all his own. He wields 7 swords at once, holding them in impossible positions, gripping blades in the crook of his arm, behind his back, even in his mouth. It's a wild, chaotic fighting style that looks like it shouldn't work at all. And it's easy to underestimate a man like that. But underneath the rhymes and the swagger was one of the most disciplined minds in the entire story. Because to hold the 8 tails in friendship, Bee had to master something Naruto hadn't yet learned. He had to quiet his own hatred. He had to listen. And so, this unlikely figure, this cheerful, joking swordsman, became the mentor who unlocked the trust that finally calmed the great fox. That's the part worth sitting with. The turning point in Kurama's centuries of rage didn't come from a legendary warrior or an ancient sage. It came from a man rapping on a training island, patiently teaching a stubborn teenager that strength and respect were the same thing. Bee gave Naruto the key, and Naruto used it to reach out to Kurama, not with force, but with understanding. So when the 9 tails finally stopped snarling, when it finally offered its power instead of having it torn away, that moment traced all the way back to Killer Bee, to the beast he befriended first, to the lesson he carried. The hands that had once only reached out to control Kurama had, at last, reached out to understand it. And that quiet shift, more than any jutsu or battle, was what truly began to calm the great fox. What very few people realize is that Ashura Ōtsutsuki, the younger son of the sage of the 6 paths, is where Kurama's entire existence quietly begins. To understand where the great fox truly came from, you have to travel back long before the ninja villages, before the walls and the wars, to a family drama that Masashi Kishimoto layered into the manga late in its run. Because the fox we now know as the 9 tails wasn't always a fox at all. Here's the part that catches most people off guard. Kurama and the other tailed beasts weren't born as beasts. They didn't emerge from some ancient forest or crawl out of the sea as monsters. They were created, deliberately, when the dying sage of the 6 paths took the colossal chakra of the 10 tails and split it into 9 separate living beings. Each one was given form, and more importantly, each one was given a name. Kurama was the 9th. So the creature that entire nations would come to fear was, at its origin, a piece of something much larger, gently divided and set free. But this is where the counterintuitive part comes in, and it reshapes how you see everything that follows. We tend to imagine the tailed beasts as weapons, as forces to be contained. Yet the sage didn't split the 10 tails out of caution or as a prison sentence. He did it out of hope. He wanted these 9 beings to be companions, individuals who would live, grow, and one day reunite to understand what true peace actually meant. That was the intention behind their creation, not fear, not control. A father hoping his children would find each other again. So Kurama's earliest memory isn't of battle or of being sealed away. Its earliest memory is of a voice, a father figure, and a name spoken directly to it. And that single detail explains so much about the fox's personality across the entire series. It's why Kurama bristled at being treated as a mass of raw power, as nothing more than chakra to be harnessed. It had been named. It had been seen as someone, not something, right from the very beginning. Everything the fox resented afterward was, in a sense, a betrayal of that first moment of being recognized. Now, and this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, Kishimoto didn't leave this history as background lore. He wove it directly into Naruto himself through the idea of reincarnation. The sage of the six paths had two sons, Indra the elder and Ashura the younger. Ashura inherited his father's belief that strength comes from love, from bonds, from reaching out to others rather than standing above them. And Kishimoto tied Ashura's line of reincarnation directly to Naruto. So the boy destined to befriend Kurama was, spiritually, a descendant of the very family that gave the fox its life in the first place. Sit with that for a moment, because the symmetry is remarkable. The sage created Kurama, hoping his children would one day be understood as individuals. Generations later, his own reincarnated descendant becomes the one person who finally offers Kurama exactly that. When Naruto looked at the fox and chose to understand it rather than command it, he was, without knowing it at first, completing something his spiritual ancestor had set in motion an age ago. The circle that Ashura's father had drawn was quietly being closed. But there's a behind-the-scenes wrinkle worth mentioning, because this reincarnation framework wasn't part of Naruto's original blueprint. Kishimoto developed the Ōtsutsuki lineage and the sage's backstory much later in the manga, which is why so many earlier details suddenly gained a deeper resonance in hindsight. Fans who had followed the story for years found that Naruto's instinctive kindness toward Kurama, something that had simply felt like his character, was retroactively given a mythological root. It was a case of an author reaching back into his own work and revealing a foundation that made the whole structure feel intentional. So when you trace it all the way down, the enmity between Naruto and Kurama was never really the natural order of things. It was a distortion. The fox and the boy were, at the deepest level of the story's lore, connected through a family that had wished for exactly the kind of understanding they eventually reached. The seal that bound them together wasn't the beginning of their relationship. It was a detour from a bond that had been intended from the start. And that's why the calm that finally settled over Kurama carries so much weight. It wasn't just one jinchūriki learning to coexist with one-tailed beast. It was the fulfillment of an ancient hope. The moment Ashura's dream of companionship and true peace found a small, quiet home in a single fox and a single boy. The father figure who had once spoken Kurama's name would, through his descendant, finally have that name honored. The great fox had spent lifetimes being feared for its power, but at its very origin, it had simply been a child of the sage, given a name, and asked only to be understood. The story of Jiraiya begins not with the fox, but with a knot of ink and chakra pressed onto the belly of a newborn. When Naruto was still an infant, his father Minato had already placed the strongest of seals over Kurama, the 8 trigrams pattern that bound the great fox in place. But that seal alone was not the end of the matter, because a second, quieter piece of work would come into play years later, and the hand that resolved it belonged to Jiraiya. This is where the record turns surprising, because the man most people remember for his jokes and his wandering was, in truth, one of the careful guardians of Kurama's confinement. To understand why, you have to look at a smaller, less famous seal. It was called the 5-element seal, a technique meant to disrupt the flow of chakra. Orochimaru struck Naruto with it during the Chunin exams, and the effect was blunt. The seal cut Naruto off from the fox's chakra and threw his own chakra into disorder, so that the very training Naruto was trying to complete kept collapsing beneath him. So Jiraiya did something that, at first glance, looks almost simple. He undid that interference. He tore down the wall that had been raised between the student and the beast sealed inside him. That choice is the contrary heart of this whole story. You might expect a teacher to keep a young ninja away from a weapon as vast as a tailed beast. But Jiraiya believed the opposite once the timing was right. He judged that Naruto needed a clear path to his own chakra and to the borrowed power sealed within before he could truly grow. The unsealing was not meant to hand the fox over recklessly. It was meant to control the timing, to decide when that power could safely return. In quiet terms, Jiraiya was managing the schedule of Kurama's release, and he did it by restoring what Orochimaru had blocked. That decision only makes sense when you trace where Jiraiya came from, because he was not simply some passing mentor. He was one of the 3 legendary Sannin of the Hidden Leaf, and long before that, he was the teacher of Minato Namikaze himself, the man who would become the 4th Hokage. So the seal on Naruto's stomach was, in a way, a family matter. The father sealed the fox, and the father's own teacher watched over the son. That lineage carried a weight most viewers pass over on a first watch. Minato had a wish, spoken in his final moments, that Naruto might one day befriend the fox and stand beside it rather than against it. Jiraiya, as Minato's student, quietly inherited that hope and carried it forward. And yet the most unexpected part is still to come, because Jiraiya's role reached beyond a single seal. Kishimoto used him as a bridge to a whole hidden world, the Toad Sages of Mount Myoboku. Jiraiya had signed the Toad contract in his youth, and through that bond, he opened a door that Naruto would later walk through. It was on that mountain, among the toads, that Naruto learned Sage Mode, the art of drawing in the natural energy of the world and blending it with his own chakra. This matters more than it seems, because that same sage training became one of the tools that later helped Naruto meet Kurama on steadier ground. So the man who once restored the fox's chakra to reach was also the man who pointed toward the path that would help control it. Follow that chain and a pattern appears. Jiraiya cleared away the block on the fox's power by undoing the 5-element seal. Therefore, Naruto could grow with his own chakra whole again. Naruto grew, therefore he was ready to travel to Mount Myoboku. He reached the mountain through Jiraiya's connection to the toads. Therefore, he gained Sage Mode. And Sage Mode strengthened him for the eventual moment when he would truly face Kurama inside himself. Each step leads into the next, and Jiraiya stands at the start of nearly every link. Here is the detail that turns into a strange little record. For all his fame as an author, a spy, and a self-proclaimed super pervert, Jiraiya's most lasting contribution to Kurama's story was almost invisible on screen. He never sealed the fox himself. He never fought it directly. His fingerprints are on a small supplementary unsealing and on a mountain training trip, 2 things easy to overlook. But without those 2 quiet acts, the timing of Kurama's power would have unfolded very differently, and the careful pace that Minato hoped for could have collapsed. So the flamboyant traveler, the man remembered for his research trips and his ridiculous entrances, was in truth one of the steady hands shaping when and how the great fox's chakra could finally be unleashed. He decided when the boy was ready, and he acted on it. He honored a dead student's wish by preparing a living one. And in the long account of Kurama, that makes Jiraiya something rare. Not the sealer, not the host, but the guardian of the schedule, the one who chose the hour when the fox and the child might finally begin to understand each other. Behind the familiar appearance of Sasuke Uchiha, there is a connection to Kurama that most viewers never stop to consider. We tend to think of the Nine Tails as Naruto's burden, Naruto's partner, Naruto's story. But the fox's relationship with the Uchiha clan runs far deeper and far older than its bond with the boy who eventually befriended it. And the reason lies in the eyes. Sasuke belongs to a bloodline defined by the Sharingan, and the Sharingan is not simply a tool for copying techniques or reading movement. In its fully matured forms, it is one of the few powers in the entire world capable of bending a tailed beast to another's will. This is the counterintuitive part. We usually frame Sasuke as the rival, the swordsman, the lightning user. Yet by lineage alone, he inherits the exact ability that was used to torment Kurama on the darkest occasions of its existence. Think about what that means. When Sasuke awakened the Rinnegan alongside his Sharingan, he gained the capacity to control the Nine Tails through Genjutsu, to seize its mind and command its body. This was not a new invention. It was the very same method Madara Uchiha used to enslave the fox and turn it against the hidden leaf, and the same method Obito used years later on the night Naruto was born. So Sasuke carries, quietly, the inheritance of the two men Kurama hated most. That is the tension the story never says aloud. Naruto earns the fox's trust the hard way, through years of shared suffering, through honesty, through finally learning the beast's name and asking for its cooperation rather than demanding it. Sasuke, by contrast, represents the older path, the Uchiha path, the one built on domination. Where one boy offers partnership, the other embodies the exact thing the fox learned to resent. The two friends are, in a sense, the two possible futures the Nine Tails could have had. And here's what almost nobody knows. This mirroring was not accidental. Masashi Kishimoto structured the entire rivalry so that the two would eventually stand as opposites in the deepest sense. Naruto descends, spiritually, from Ashura, the son who believed in cooperation and shared strength. Sasuke descends from Indra, the son who believed in power earned alone. The tailed beasts were part of Ashura's legacy of cooperation, the very idea that strength should be shared rather than seized. So when Naruto fights beside Kurama as a partner, he is expressing that inheritance directly, while Sasuke, reaching for the manifestation of Indra's power, expresses the opposite philosophy. That is why their final clash at the Valley of the End feels like more than two friends settling a grudge. On one side stands a boy fighting with a beast that chose to trust him. On the other stands a boy channeling a destiny defined by control and isolation. The battle was framed, deliberately, as beast versus destiny, cooperation versus conquest, and Kurama sat at the very center of that meaning without ever needing to speak. There is something almost sad in it when you slow down to notice. On the occasions it fell under those Uchiha eyes, the fox became a prisoner, pulled out of hosts, thrown against villages, forced to destroy things it had no quarrel with, all because a pair of red eyes decided it should. And then, at last, it met someone who did not want to use it at all. So Sasuke becomes something unexpected in the fox's story. Not the villain, not even really the enemy, but the reflection. He is the reminder of everything Kurama escaped from, standing right next to the person who helped it escape. This is the detail that flips the usual reading. We often assume the Uchiha were simply Naruto's rivals, and the tailed beasts were simply weapons in a larger war. But if you look at it from Kurama's point of view, Sasuke is the living memory of its imprisonment, walking beside its first true friend. The same technique that could have chained the fox again is carried by the very person Naruto refuses to give up on. And so the fox's freedom and the fox's oldest fear end up bound together in the same friendship. It gives Sasuke a strange, quiet importance in the fox's long history. He is proof that the eyes never stopped being dangerous, that the old method of control never truly disappeared, that even after all the peace and understanding, the possibility of domination still exists in the world. Kurama's trust in Naruto matters more, precisely because the alternative is standing right there, in the form of a friend rather than an enemy. So when we talk about the Nine Tails and the child sealed with it, we cannot fully understand that bond without understanding what it was rescued from. Sasuke is that answer. He is the cautionary reflection, the reminder of the times the fox spent being commanded rather than known. And in the end, the beast's story is not only about the friend who freed it, but also about the shadow it finally learned to stand beside without fear. If you look closely at Yamato, you find one of the strangest quiet miracles in the entire story of the Nine Tails. A character who almost didn't need to exist at all, and yet ended up holding a thread that ran straight back to the very beginning of Kurama's history. Because when Masashi Kishimoto sat down to plan the years ahead, he realized he had a problem. Naruto and the fox were bound together, but that bond was unstable, and there would come moments when the boy lost himself and the beast's chakra came pouring out. The story needed someone who could stand in front of that flood and press it back down. So Kishimoto gave that job to a single man. And the choice of who that man would be turned out to matter far more than a simple plot convenience. The reason is that Yamato was not born with this ability. He was made to have it, though not on purpose. Long before he ever met Naruto, Yamato had been one of dozens of orphan children taken by Orochimaru and used in a cruel experiment. Each of those children was injected with the DNA of Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage, in the hope of recreating his legendary wood release power. Nearly all of them died. Yamato was the only survivor. And that single fact, that he alone lived through something meant to kill everyone else, is precisely why he alone can calm a rampaging Kurama. The very thing that should have ended his life became the reason he could hold back the strongest of the tailed beasts. That connection is not a coincidence, and it isn't a small one. A century earlier, it was Hashirama himself who tamed the tailed beasts, who could stand before Kurama and quiet its fury when no one else on earth could. His body, his cells, carried something that the fox's chakra simply could not overwhelm. So when those same cells were forced into a frightened orphan, and by pure chance took hold in one boy who lived, that boy inherited a fragment of the only power that ever truly mastered the Nine Tails. Yamato became, without knowing it, a living echo of the first Hokage. But the story hides a small, elegant detail here, and it's easy to miss. When Yamato suppresses the fox's chakra, he doesn't just wave his hands and hope. He forms a special seal, and that suppression technique reaches back to the very power Hashirama Senju used to bring the tailed beasts under control, generations before Naruto was ever born. So the method itself is borrowed straight from the past, carried forward not through teaching or scrolls, but through flesh and a repeated shape, quietly echoing an act that happened 100 years earlier. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because Yamato's power, for all that it reaches back to Hashirama, is not unlimited. There is a hard ceiling built into it. He can hold back Kurama's influence only up to a certain number of tails, and no further. When Naruto stays within the early stages, 1 tail, 2, 3, Yamato's seal can press the chakra down and pull the boy back toward himself. But the moment Naruto reaches the 4-tailed form, everything changes. Yamato's power stops working. It no longer soothes the fox at all. And worse, it begins to harm Naruto's own body. The very thing meant to protect him turns painful. And that limit tells you something quiet but important. That even a fragment of the first Hokage's strength has a boundary. And beyond it, Kurama is simply too vast to be gently held. It shows, without a single word of explanation, just how far past ordinary control the Nine Tails truly is. Here is the part that surprises almost everyone, though. Yamato was never meant to be this. When Kishimoto first brought him into the story, the plan was modest. Kakashi had been injured, and the team needed a temporary leader, a short-term replacement to guide Naruto and the others while their real teacher recovered. That was the whole idea. Yamato was, in the earliest sense, a stand-in, the kind of character who could easily have faded once his brief job was done. But because Kishimoto had already tied him to Hashirama's cells, because that quiet detail was already sitting in his design, the temporary captain suddenly became something the story genuinely needed. He became the human off-switch for the Nine Tails, the one man who could step forward when Naruto's control failed. So a role that looked, at first, like filler, a placeholder to cover a gap, turned into a key thread of Kurama's lore. The lucky twist is that the two ideas were never planned to meet. A replacement captain and a suppression power drawn from the first Hokage happened to live inside the same person. And once they did, Yamato could never really leave. He remained bound to Naruto and to the fox, standing close to that ancient power not as its master, but as its quiet guardian. A happy accident that quietly changed the shape of everything that followed. Tonight, we drifted through the world of Naruto, from the beast sealed in a child all the way to Yamato and his quiet secrets. Thank you for wandering with me this far, as sleep settles softly over you now. Let these stories carry you gently into the dark. Sweet dreams.